The Witch Who Dared, the Elizabeth Montgomery story. April 1993, Los Angeles. A hospital room bathed in pale afternoon light. Outside, the city hums with indifferent energy. Inside, a woman sits propped against starched white pillows, her famous face now gaunt, her eyes still luminous with that familiar spark. Elizabeth Montgomery is dying. 8 weeks. That's all the doctors gave her after the diagnosis. Advanced colon cancer. Too late for miracles. Too late for the magic that once made her a household name. But in these final days, she makes a choice not to hide, not to retreat into the darkness that Hollywood reserves for its fading stars. Instead, she speaks about secrets, about lies, about a life lived behind the shimmering curtain of fame. 3 years earlier, she had revealed something that sent shockwaves through an industry built on illusion. Now, as her body surrenders to disease, the full truth of her story emerges. A tale of violence, passion, rebellion, and quiet courage that would redefine what it meant to be a woman in America. This is not the story of Samantha Stevens, the perfect witch wife who wiggled her nose and made problems disappear. This is the story of Elizabeth Montgomery, and it begins long before the magic ever started. April 15th, 1933, Los Angeles, California. She arrived into wealth, into privilege, into a family that from the outside glittered with promise. Robert Montgomery, matinee idol, charming leading man, the kind of actor who made women swoon in darkened theaters across Depression-era America. Elizabeth Daniel Bryan Allen Montgomery, elegant, refined, the perfect Hollywood wife. Together they built a home in Los Angeles that should have been a sanctuary. Instead, it became a prison. Behind those perfectly manicured hedges and Spanish tile walls, young Elizabeth learned her first lessons were about performance, not on a stage, not before cameras, but in the dangerous theater of survival. Her father, Robert, was an alcoholic, not the romantic, brooding kind that novels romanticize, the violent kind, the kind who disappeared for days, then returned in a rage that filled every room with terror. Elizabeth and her mother became experts in reading the signs, the set of his jaw, the particular way he slammed doors, the silence before the storm. When Robert was home, fear hung in the air like smoke. He yelled, he struck, he shattered the illusion that his public smile promised. When he was gone, a different kind of darkness descended. Elizabeth's mother suffered from crippling depression, sinking into states where she could barely function, barely care for the daughter who desperately needed her. The child learned early. Trust no one, depend on yourself, survive. Hollywood in the 1930s and 40s was a carnival of excess. Alcohol flowing like water, drugs passed between parties, sex treated as currency. Elizabeth witnessed it all before adolescence, her childhood stolen by proximity to a world that devoured innocence. Yet something in her refused to break. Perhaps it was stubbornness. Perhaps it was the very trait she inherited from her father, a relentless determination to perform, to succeed, to be seen. Whatever the reason, Elizabeth decided that she would not be a victim of her past. She would become something more. Early 1950s, the beginning. After graduating from acting school, Elizabeth faced a choice that would define her relationship with her father forever. She could take his name, Montgomery, and ride his coattails into easy roles. Or she could forge her own path, prove herself on merit, refuse the safety of nepotism. She chose defiance. When she asked to appear on his television program, Robert Montgomery Presents, the request came loaded with subtext. She wasn't asking for charity. She was demanding recognition, the right to stand on the same stage as him, not behind him. Robert agreed reluctantly. Perhaps he saw in her the same fierce ambition that had driven him to stardom. Perhaps he feared it. Either way, something between them fractured that day, a wound that would never fully heal. Elizabeth carried that wound into everything that followed, the desperate need for approval, the fear of disappointing those she loved, the pattern that would repeat again and again in relationships built on unsteady ground. In 1954, at 21 years old, Elizabeth married Frederick Kamen, a businessman, older, stable, respectable, everything her father might approve of, everything Hollywood was not. It was a disaster from the start. Kamen wanted a wife who would abandon the stage, who would settle into comfortable domesticity, who would fade quietly into the background of his successful life. Elizabeth tried. She genuinely tried. But the role suffocated her. Acting wasn't just a career. It was oxygen. It was purpose. It was the one place where she could transform pain into power, fear into art. The marriage lasted only a few years before collapsing under the weight of fundamental incompatibility. Elizabeth emerged bruised, her reputation slightly tarnished in an era when divorce carried social stigma, but free. Then Hollywood offered her a lifeline and a new complication. She was cast opposite Gary Cooper, one of cinema's greatest legends, in a film that would showcase her dramatic range. Cooper was older, weathered by life and fame, possessing a quiet magnetism that drew people into his orbit. Elizabeth fell. Their affair was whispered about in studio corridors, discussed in coded language over expensive lunches. Cooper became the father figure she'd never had, protective, attentive, affirming, but he was also married, making their connection both intoxicating and impossible. When it ended, Elizabeth was left with another scar, another lesson in the cost of seeking love in broken places. But she was also left with something else, recognition. Her performance had been noticed. Doors were opening. 1963, a turning point. Johnny Cool should have been just another crime thriller. Instead, it became the moment Elizabeth Montgomery transformed from competent actress into captivating star. Her performance radiated confidence, sexuality, and intelligence, qualities that Hollywood typically forced women to choose between, never allowed to combine. Audiences responded. So did the film's director, William Asher. Asher was more than 10 years her senior, experienced, charming, complicated. He saw in Elizabeth not just talent, but potential, the raw material for something extraordinary. They fell in love with the intensity of creative collaborators who believe they can build empires together. They married in the romantic glow of early 1960s Hollywood, just as television was entering its golden age, and together they stumbled across a script that seemed quirky, promising, and potentially perfect for Elizabeth's particular blend of beauty and mischief. A modern witch married to a mortal man, magic hidden in suburban normalcy, comedy wrapped around deeper themes of identity and conformity. They called it Bewitched, and it changed everything. September 17th, 1964, Bewitched premieres. When Elizabeth Montgomery first twitched her nose as Samantha Stevens, wiggling it in that distinctive way that would become iconic, she created something that transcended entertainment. Samantha was powerful but constrained, magical but domesticated, capable of bending reality but choosing to fold laundry. American audiences, especially women, saw themselves in that contradiction, the gap between potential and permission, between power and propriety. The show became an instant phenomenon. Elizabeth became a star, but behind the sparkling surface, darkness gathered. During the filming of the first season, Elizabeth discovered she was pregnant. In the early 1960s, this was a crisis. Television standards were strict. Pregnancy wasn't discussed. Married couples still slept in separate beds on screen. The idea of the lead actress visibly carrying a child was unthinkable. The production scrambled, wide dresses, strategic camera angles, filming scenes out of order to capture material before her belly grew too large to hide. After she gave birth, the crew rushed to complete remaining episodes, working exhausting hours to maintain the illusion of continuity. Elizabeth powered through it all, new mother, television star, maintaining perfection, while her body and heart adjusted to massive changes. Then the producers had an idea. Introduce Samantha's cousin Serena, a wild, seductive, free-spirited version of the character. Elizabeth would play both roles, showcasing her range while adding spice to the series. Audiences love Serena, so apparently did William Asher. According to crew members who worked on the set, there were occasions when Elizabeth, still dressed in Serena's costumes and makeup, would leave with Asher during breaks. They'd drive to a nearby motel, return hours later. Rumors spread like wildfire through the small, contained world of television production. While the real-life husband indulged himself, the on-screen husband was quietly disintegrating. Dick York had once been handsome, vital, full of comedic energy. The actor cast as Darren Stevens brought charm and everyman relatability to the role of Samantha's mortal husband. But York carried a secret burden, a severe back injury from an earlier film that left him in constant grind and pain. At first, he managed painkillers, rest between takes, determination to push through. But as seasons progressed, the injury worsened. York began drinking to dull the agony. Pills and alcohol became his crutches, literal and metaphorical. He started missing episodes, filming scenes lying down. Crew members whispered concerns, but the show had to continue. Production schedules waited for no one. Then came the day Elizabeth arrived on set to find York visibly intoxicated. In his pain-addled, chemically altered state, he confessed something he'd kept buried for years. He was in love with her, genuinely, hopelessly in love with the woman who played his television wife. The cruel irony. His confession echoed across a set where the woman's actual husband sat in the director's chair just feet away. The atmosphere changed instantly. Tension replaced the easy camaraderie that had defined early seasons. Elizabeth maintained professionalism, but the damage was done. Shortly after, during a routine filming day, York collapsed. Paramedics carried him from the set. He never returned to Bewitched, replaced by actor Dick Sargent, who stepped into the role with no explanation given to confused viewers. Elizabeth didn't dwell on it. She couldn't afford to. The show had to continue. The magic couldn't stop just because hearts were breaking behind the curtain, but life, as always, had other plans. Richard Michaels arrived to direct later seasons of Bewitched. Professional, talented, married, he and Elizabeth developed a connection that began as creative partnership and transformed into something far more dangerous. In the close quarters of television production, where crew members work side by side for endless hours, secrets are nearly impossible to keep. Their affair became an open secret, meaningful glances, disappearances between scenes, the electric tension that anyone with eyes could observe. When the truth finally exploded into public knowledge, it devastated two marriages simultaneously. Elizabeth divorced William Asher. Richard Michaels left his wife. The collateral damage was extensive. Children confused, families fractured, a production set transformed into an emotional battlefield. Elizabeth walked away from her second divorce carrying guilt, regret, and a growing sense that she was trapped in a pattern she couldn't break. Meanwhile, Bewitched continued filming. Seasons piled up, 8 years. Over 200 episodes. Elizabeth began to feel imprisoned by Samantha Stevens, the perfect wife, the gentle witch, a character increasingly distant from the complicated, wounded woman she actually was. She wanted to stop, to walk away, to find roles that reflected her depth, her intelligence, her lived experience of pain and survival. The producers responded with money, substantial amounts of money, contracts that made walking away financially devastating. So Elizabeth smiled, twitched her nose, performed magic for cameras while dying inside. When Bewitched finally ended in 1972, Elizabeth Montgomery was 40 years old, divorced twice, famous beyond measure, and profoundly lost. But she was also, for the first time in 8 years, free. Freedom looked different than Elizabeth imagined. No husband, no weekly series, no script dictating her every move. At first, the emptiness was terrifying. Then it became liberating. Elizabeth began seeking roles that challenged her, that reflected the complexity she felt inside. In 1977, she starred in A Killing Affair, playing a tough police officer who falls in love with an African-American colleague, portrayed by O.J. Simpson. In 1970s America, interracial relationships remained deeply controversial. Southern states had only recently struck down laws banning interracial marriage. Depicting such a relationship on television was bold, risky, potentially career-damaging. Critics were divided. Some praised Elizabeth's courage, others condemned her harshly, accusing her of promoting immorality, of betraying American values. Looking back decades later, after O.J. Simpson became synonymous with one of America's most notorious murder cases, Elizabeth's early exit from his orbit seems almost prophetic, as if some instinct, some survival mechanism honed in childhood steered her away from that particular darkness. But Elizabeth wasn't just breaking racial taboos, she was breaking political ones too. The 1970s, America was tearing itself apart over Vietnam. Young men were drafted, sent to jungles on the other side of the world, told they were fighting for freedom and democracy. Many never returned. Those who did came back broken, haunted by atrocities committed and witnessed. While government propaganda glorified sacrifice and patriotic duty, Elizabeth Montgomery used her platform to say what many thought but feared to voice. The war was meaningless, a wound on the American conscience, a catastrophic failure of leadership that consumed lives without purpose. In an era of fervent nationalism, this stance drew fierce backlash. She received hate mail, death threats, accusations of being anti-American, communist, a traitor. Elizabeth refused to back down. She appeared on talk shows, gave interviews, carried messages of compassion and peace. For a television star at the height of her fame, such activism was remarkably dangerous. Studios preferred their actors silent on controversial topics. Controversy hurt ratings, hurt profits. Elizabeth didn't care. She had learned through years of surviving her father's violence and Hollywood's exploitation. That silence was complicity. But her most revolutionary act wasn't political. It was personal. While women across America burned bras in protest of gender inequality, Elizabeth Montgomery chose a subtler form of rebellion. Through Samantha Stevens, she had spent 8 years portraying a woman with limitless power, forced to live as a submissive housewife, always placing her husband's comfort above her own abilities. But Elizabeth infused that performance with intelligence, confidence, and subtle defiance that transformed Samantha into something more than a comedic character. She became a symbol, a metaphor, a reflection of every woman who felt the gap between who she was and who society demanded she be. The New York Times praised Samantha as a hopeful figure for a society in transition. Elizabeth had taken a silly premise about a witch and turned it into quiet feminist commentary. She even smuggled rebellion into the smallest details. When producers insisted she dress more conservatively, Elizabeth refused to wear a bra on set, a silent declaration broadcast into millions of American homes that women had the right to control their own bodies. That small act became a quiet shockwave, noticed by women who saw in it permission to question their own restrictions. But Elizabeth didn't just fight for women. She fought for everyone marginalized by society's narrow definitions of acceptable existence. Dick Sargent, who replaced Dick York as Darren Stevens in the later seasons of Bewitched, carried his own secret. He was gay. In Hollywood. In the 1960s and 70s, an era when revealing one's sexuality could mean career destruction, arrest, violence, when Sargent finally came out decades later, Elizabeth didn't just express support from a safe distance. In 1992, she joined him as co-Grand Marshal of the Los Angeles Gay Pride Parade, marching publicly alongside him in a gesture that declared to the world, "I see you. I stand with you. You are not alone." In truth, Bewitched had always been a kind of sanctuary for people living outside society's rigid norms. Paul Lynde, who played the witty Uncle Arthur, Maurice Evans, the distinguished grandfather, Agnes Moorehead, who portrayed Samantha's strong-willed mother, Endora. Almost the entire cast and crew were part of or closely connected to the LGBTQ+ community. As Elizabeth herself once explained, the witch was a metaphor for anyone forced to hide their true identity, to live in fear of exposure, to use magic words like passing and closeted just to survive. During an era when being gay could cost you everything, Bewitched became a subtle, poignant symbol of the longing to live authentically. Together, they formed a chosen family, a safe space where everyone could be themselves without judgment. Then came the 1980s, and with it, AIDS. The epidemic swept across America like a medieval plague, devastating the gay community with horrifying speed. Men Elizabeth had worked with, laughed with, loved began disappearing. Obituaries filled with euphemisms, complications from pneumonia, long illness, never the truth. Fear and stigma surrounded the disease. Politicians ignored it. Religious leaders called it divine punishment. Hospitals refused to treat patients. Families disowned dying sons, while many Hollywood stars remained silent, terrified of association with a gay disease. Elizabeth spoke out. She raised funds for AIDS organizations, visited dying friends in hospitals where nurses wouldn't enter rooms without full protective gear, treating human beings like toxic waste. She used her fame to demand compassion, research, recognition that these were lives worth saving. In a society clouded by stigma, her voice shone as a rare beacon of humanity. But even Elizabeth Montgomery couldn't outrun mortality forever. Spring 1995, the diagnosis. Advanced colon cancer, stage 4, metastasized throughout her body. The doctors gave her 8 weeks. Elizabeth, who had survived an abusive childhood, 2 painful divorces, professional exploitation, and decades of carrying secrets, faced this final challenge with characteristic grace. She didn't hide, didn't seek pity, didn't rage against the injustice of life cut short. Instead, she gathered her family and friends close, made peace with the past, and prepared to leave with dignity. On May 18, 1995, at age 62, Elizabeth Montgomery died. Look back at that hospital room. April 1993. Elizabeth Montgomery sitting in pale afternoon light. Dying, speaking truth that Hollywood had tried for decades to silence. What secret had she revealed 3 years before her death that shocked the world? Perhaps it wasn't a single revelation, but the accumulated weight of her entire life, the violence she survived, the pattern she couldn't break, the courage to keep fighting anyway. She wasn't a perfect wife, wasn't a flawless mother, made mistakes, hurt people, carried regrets. But she was authentic. She used her platform to defend the defenseless, to question authority, to live by principles even when it cost her professionally and personally, to stand with marginalized communities when it was dangerous to do so. Elizabeth Montgomery was more than Samantha Stevens, more than a witch who wiggled her nose and made problems disappear. She was a woman who understood that the greatest magic isn't in spells or illusions. It's in the courage to live truthfully, to refuse silence when speaking risks everything, to transform pain into purpose, fear into defiance, personal suffering into public advocacy. In the end, that's the real story, not the scandals or secrets, not the affairs or divorces, but the quiet, persistent bravery of a woman who survived a traumatic childhood and used that survival to illuminate paths for others walking through darkness. She died more than 2 decades ago, but her legacy, the witch who dared to be human, continues casting light.